Good morning. Welcome to day 2 of Mining News Select. My name's Chris Cann. I'm the managing editor of Aspermont's mining and event business. I'll be your chair today, as I was yesterday. Thanks for making it back, for those of you who were with us yesterday. We've got a full day of pictures and panels again for you. Yesterday I unveiled a huge amount of insight into commodity markets and presented, I think it was about 14 different investment opportunities for people to get involved in, so hopefully something similar today. There is some more housekeeping to quickly whiz through before we get to our first panel. Slido wasn't a huge hit yesterday, so we probably won't be using that again today. There will be roving mics though, so if you have got any questions for panellists or presenters, just put your hand up and one of the mics will come round. If you are engaging in social media, if you could use the MNS Perth hashtag, that would be great. And I would like to thank our sponsors as well who make all this possible. Our exploration partner, DDH1 Drilling, our broker partner, JP Equity Partners, our PR partner, White Noise, our legal partner, Hetherington, our lead media partner, Hot Copper, and our partners over at AMEC as well. As you can hear, the Future of Mining event is happening next door as well. That's a more operations-focused event, but a lot of insights about the industry and the way it's shaping up available over there, and you've got access to that program as well. So please do get involved. So into our first panel. This is about understanding critical minerals. What are they, for a start, and which are the minerals likely to perform best in the near and mid-term. If you'd welcome your panellists, Namali Mackay, who is Managing Director of the Critical Minerals Association of Australia, Frank van Rooyen, who is Senior Director of Resources and WA Northern Australia Infrastructure Facility, and Michael Scantlebury, who is a Resources Analyst with Euroz Hartleys. If you could make them welcome. I'm not sure where to pitch this in terms of everyone's understanding of critical minerals, so we might start fairly broad and basic, if that's all right, and just try and get an understanding of what are critical minerals. Every different organisation around the world in government seems to have a different definition and a different list. How would you sum up critical minerals?
Start with me.
Yeah, let's just go. Yeah, let's work our way across.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and you're right. There's a different definition, slightly different definition in each country, and I guess I would divide the minerals into a couple of categories. One is where, there's a supply issue, a supply bottleneck, or the supply chain can't meet demand, basically. They're critical. We have a huge demand, we can't meet it with supply, is one aspect, and it's directly going into some of those industries that are essential, like EVs or wind turbines or some of that future-facing industry. And then there's a group of minerals, I would say, that are indirectly supporting that transition, and they would be so the first category would be things like lithium, nickel, etc. And then the second category would be those that support that green tech, and enable the green tech to happen. So whether it's gallium, scandium, those kinds of minerals that actually provide an input into it. But you're right, the definition is not agreed, it's not standard, and it's essentially where there are minerals that are needed for the future transition, but there's a supply and demand disparity. There may be sovereign risks involved, and there might be some supply chain bottlenecks, I guess is an overarching start. But you guys might have something to add to that.
Yeah, I suppose from a NAIF perspective, we're essentially a government fund that's set up, and one of our roles is to help develop critical minerals projects. The commodities that we see mostly at the moment in terms of near-term opportunities are basically lithium, rare earths, vanadium, and HPA. Those are probably where I would say, probably 80% of the opportunities that we see in terms of near term. There are a few other sort of more speciality commodities coming up, tungsten, manganese, graphite, and the like. But there's probably only one or two projects like that we are actually looking at in those sectors, whereas in the others there's quite a few of them. Yeah.
So they're the ones that are essentially attracting interest at the moment, because when you look at the lists, depending on which government you're talking about, there's 50 minerals on in the EU, or the 70 in the EU and 50 in the US, something like that. There's so many. It's almost like what's not a critical mineral. So I suppose from an investment perspective, which are the ones that are actually attracting interest, Frank, from your perspective, from a funding perspective?
Yeah, like I said, it's those four. Those really. So it's the most active: lithium, rare earths, vanadium, and HPA. Having said that, the market for some of those products is not that big either. So say like we've got at least 10 vanadium projects in sort of feasibility study across Australia. Actually, there's more than that. The reality is that the market for that, it can probably absorb maybe one or two projects within the next, say, 3 years. So therefore, us as a government financially, we're going to have to select. There's no way that we can finance every project, because it's just not going to happen. We have to pick the ones that are, I suppose, more robust and are, more advanced.
Okay. I mean, talking about in terms of priorities and how critical they are, surely that comes into it.
That's true as well. Yeah. And say like rare earths in particular, that from a government point of view, that is right at the top of the list, because there's likely to be a significant shortfall of rare earths from the Western world. Yeah.
Michael, in terms of like how the equity markets see it, do you see that kind of selection of critical minerals being reflected in what investors are actually putting their money into?
Yeah, sure. I mean, at the moment, I think I'd create the argument that the critical minerals is probably much more broadly, because even without something as simple as copper, you can view that as a critical mineral, because without copper, there is no energy transition, and the sheer scale of that mineral alone, you need it, in some estimates, doubling production by 2035. And we get focused in so many of these niche metals, but without something as basic as copper supply increasing in the order of twofold over the next 10 years, there won't be a requirement for all these niche metals, so you can forget about it. But so the money is finding its way into the sectors. It's probably the easiest place to attract financing. It's become a lot easier from an equity point of view. But they are going for the more tried and tested kind of general areas, as people are looking for areas that have had success in the past and not as willing to explore into the more niche metals at this time, because the markets are so small, as Frank touched on.
Okay, I mean, what would we describe as niche?
Well, I mean, I guess some of those less well understood commodities, the ones that don't necessarily, not in Frank's top list, the ones that, your scandiums and galliums or whatever. But to Michael's point about copper, it's absolutely right, but it's not a critical mineral in Australia yet. So that list is actually currently being reconsidered, and so there's a question about that.
I think it just got added to the US list a few months back. Is that right? It feels like it's gives people political appetite to permit projects or accelerate the permitting of projects. If you're not in a critical minerals list, then you'll struggle these days. If you are on the list, you'll be able to get your projects through. Would that be reasonable?
Theoretically.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, from a NAIF perspective, we can finance non-critical minerals, but however, I suppose the risk appetite of the fund is greater for critical minerals. That's very, yeah. I can't comment about the permitting process because we're not part of that.
Of course, yeah.
I think on the permitting side, for equity markets, it'd be easily one of the largest risks, if not the largest risk, for attracting financing. In even some states in Australia, Victoria, you can basically just forget about permitting a mine there. Equity markets are just not interested in going there, and people talk about the wanting and the need for all these critical minerals, but no one wants a mine in their backyard. It seems to be, there's only select jurisdictions that the equity market is willing to actually go and finance. No one wants to wait 10 years for a permit and wants to see, a West Australian mine approved in a reasonable time frame, 6 years, where you can discount that cash flow back to today's value and actually attract financing. It's certainly an area of concern for investors that we talk to.
The elephant in the room is probably China's influence on all of this. Yeah, Frank, I won't test you on that one, given your role. But Namali, maybe starting with you in terms of how China's policy and the supply chain security issue and concern is driving, not just Australia's critical minerals policy, but the IRA, etc., the European Critical Raw Materials Act as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's no doubt China has a massive influence in the critical minerals space. For Australia, I mean, what's interesting is there's a huge Chinese investment in Australia in critical minerals, and it's often linked to offtake in a way that it's a bit harder with Western, investment. So it's kind of spurred on this industry in Australia to a great extent, and arguably perhaps some of those projects wouldn't have gone ahead without that Chinese investment. But the flip side of it is that we are, it's kind of this marriage of inconvenience for Australia, really, because we're stuck in this. It's higher risk. Critical minerals are higher risk because China has this huge sort of monopoly on the midstream, further downstream, and because we are an extractor, we are heavily reliant on going into that market at the moment. There's not much alternative, and so really they set the price, and price is kind of key in this sector. And so there's the marriage of inconvenience comes around in terms of we have this great alliance with our, military alliance with our like-minded nations, and led by the US, they're pushing to diversify away from China. And we have our largest trading partner here on our doorstep, and with a lot of investment in Australia. So, I think it's in Australia's interest, regardless of whether it's China or otherwise, to have a diversified supply chain and alternatives. But you're right that cannot be avoided, that is a dominant factor in all aspects of the critical mineral supply chain. And the monopoly has an impact on price, on the way the market operates, how vulnerable we are. And there is quite a big list there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, China's they're well established. They're controlling basically the entire supply chains of the electric vehicle market. You can just look at the exports of electric vehicles recently of cars in general has overtaken Japan. So they're absolutely dominating the market. They've got a 10 to 15 year head start on the Western world. Europeans have been talking about funding all these critical mineral projects, but a lot of talk and no action. IRA, the US is they talked and they've acted. It's coming on quite quickly. But still, China makes decade-long plans. Australia and the Western world are on election cycles, 3 to 4 years. So they've secured their supply chains, and we're only just catching up to it. On the Western world kind of thing. So, I think we've still got a long way to go. But the moves and the money is starting to flow into the sector, which is well and truly needed. But yeah, well and truly behind the 8 ball in the Western world.
Frank, you don't want to stick your neck out on this one? I've got another question.
Well, yeah. No, I mean, basically that, the aim of the Australian government's critical minerals policy is to develop Australia as a reliable supplier of critical minerals, and to diversify supply chains, to basically build robust, diversified, and sustainable supply chains. So that's all I can probably say.
I haven't got the figures on me, so please feel free to correct me. But I think the opening panel yesterday, this came up obviously, talking about movements in commodity markets, what's driving them. I think the Inflation Reduction Act, depending on where you kind of start and finish it, it's something in the order of 365 billion. I think I saw a number yesterday of up to $1 trillion with various drivers there. Australia's critical minerals policy and the funding behind it is something like 500 million. Is that right?
That's not quite right.
No.
To sort of say, okay, So NAIF has got it's a $7 billion fund.
Okay.
Out of the $7 billion, $500 million has been earmarked for critical minerals.
Okay.
However, our pipeline is significantly bigger than that. So therefore, there is no upside. So like there is no limit to how big we can go, other than I suppose like the size of the fund. But the minimum that we will invest is $500 million. In addition to that, there is the critical minerals facility, which is basically managed by Export Finance Australia. That's a $2 billion fund. Now, out of that, they have allocated approximately $1.5 billion, so there's another $500 million left. But again, the ability to increase that fund is not that hard. It's relatively easy. Then on top of that, there are two other government-owned entities that can finance critical minerals. One of them is Clean Energy Finance Corporation,
okay.
And then they've just set up the National Reconstruction Fund.
Okay.
So all of those four funds can effectively finance critical minerals. So, yeah.
So that feels like that's an ongoing conversation. It's what
Yes.
do we need and where do we take the money from? But
Correct, that's
there's
right.
no ceiling.
Technically not, no.
Okay. How does the IRA, the Critical Raw Materials Act in Europe, I know Canada has its own policy, Mexico has its own policy, everyone seems to have their own policy. How does Australia's fit in with that? Because obviously Australia's essentially, I think what's the term we'd use, dig and ship, basically. The world's mine, the world's mining playground, basically. How does Australia's need to go downstream work in parallel with much more powerful policies elsewhere in the world? Namali, maybe.
Yeah, so the IRA obviously seems to be sort of leading out there in terms of the types of incentives plus the volume of incentives. And I guess for Australia, having that sort of free trade agreement relationship where it could be a partner of choice to supply, that supply chain is a great thing. It is, once it's enacted. But the thing to remember is that the IRA is about building domestic US capacity. It's in their interest, and it's about onshoring to build in the US and to ensure that their sovereign capability. So it kind of entrenches us still in that dig and ship model. It doesn't help us with our goal of moving further downstream. So, but the flip side is, as Frank was saying, the objective is to diversify. It gives us a path to diversify to a more, I suppose, reliable partner in the sense that's not like a monopoly situation that we're going into yet.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the two are aligned, as in like the Australian Critical Minerals Policy and the IRA are aligned in that it aims to build more, robust and diverse supply chains. The Australian tools that we have are a little bit different. Well, like the Australian government's sort of aim to stimulate the industry is essentially through concessional loans, whereas the IRA is more about tax breaks. That's really the key difference.
Okay.
So yeah, as to whether one is better than the other, I mean, we'll see. Yeah.
If there's sleight of hand in terms of just the way it's structured, if one is more powerful in terms of the investment being offered, would that mean, normally, as you're saying, you would naturally entrench Australia in the same position it's currently in? Because NAIF's requirements for investment, the raw materials need to be pushed into Australian downstream industry, is that right? Not
really, no. So, I mean, our mandate is extremely broad, but the key thing is that we look at whether the project is aligned with government policy. And downstream processing in Australia is one of the key priorities of the government, so we definitely look at that. So we would give preference to a project that processes in Australia as opposed to a project that digs it up and then sells it straight overseas. It doesn't mean that you're not like that you don't qualify for like a loan, but we just give preference to the downstream processing projects. Yeah.
I mean, I guess what we would say is that, you know, Australia can't necessarily sort of compete with the sort of, you know, out-subsidised China or the US. But I guess what the government could be doing is potentially looking at, you know, some of those tax breaks and incentives here just to create the enabling environment to, you know, just incentivise some of that downstream movement in that midstream refining area. But also the other thing I would say is there probably, there does need to be a huge focus and investment on the infrastructure that supports the midstream and particularly cheap energy. So that kind of enabling environment will do a lot to help the industry. Yeah.
Frank, can you give us any insight in terms of those kind of conversations? I mean, do you see them happening?
See, within NAIF, we don't actually set policy. we implement policy. So, I mean, we have our personal views sort of thing, but I don't know whether that's really going to change things. So.
I mean, I think the Australian government said that sort of tax incentives are not off the table. I don't know if that means they're on the table.
It's not particularly dynamic language, is it?
Yeah.
So I think that, you know, I mean, this is not your area, Frank, but just, you know, actually working up to looking at that. But as you know, Michael was saying, time is of the essence here in this sector.
I was just going to touch on the energy policy. One of the things, because these downstream plants, whether it's, you know, lithium or rare earths, are very, very energy intensive. A lot of them are using kilns, and the high energy costs would essentially just kill these downstream plants. And, you know, WA is probably blessed with its gas reservation policy and cheap energy, but the East Coast is heading in the complete wrong direction. And then you've got the federal government writing off, you know, industry advice on considering nuclear power down the stream, which is, I think, is a complete wrong path. But so they're not showing an open mind to lowering energy costs. So, you know, not exactly holding out too much hope for policy going forward. And then probably just on attracting, you know, downstream investment, you've got governments, you know, not providing policy certainty in terms of taxation. You just have to look at the, you know, petroleum resource rent tax, and they're talking about increasing that. How you expect, you know, foreign investment coming into Australia and in downstream in the, you know, in critical minerals, if they're just going to go and change the rules on you essentially halfway through, and then you could look at the Queensland government increasing royalties on coal as well. So I think the policy certainty attracting investment into the downstream area and critical minerals is probably what foreign investment's looking for, and the equity markets are definitely looking for.
Okay. I mean, if we're looking at just going back to those policies that are driving the investment into critical raw materials, as a global phenomenon, as opposed to looking at what Australia's doing versus the US, what are the, Michael, probably one for you, what are the commodities that are proving the winners at the moment for the investment community?
Yeah, I think it just goes back to what I touched on earlier. Is probably just the tried and tested. It's where you've seen companies make money, and, you know, Pilgangoora, so Pilbara Minerals project is a classic example. So a lot of people trying to follow them in that footpath. So it's where people have actually brought projects online in a reasonable fashion and generated cash flow. So lithium is the obvious example of where money's going into. You know, the current cathode technology of nickel. So that's attracting and downstream into you know, producing those cathode plants. And then probably graphite as well is probably the three areas that are attracting a fair bit of investment. As you know, people can see the need for them now, but, you know, it's probably with those forward-looking, where the markets are probably a little bit too small, is kind of the next stage, and it's, you know, the high purity alumina. It's probably further rare earth materials that's required in some of these developing technologies, as well as the market demand kind of expands for them.
Okay. Inflation obviously has a role to play in all this in terms of the cost of projects is increasing. Frank, one for you. What's the government's role in these funding structures, given that they do need more money, they do need more support? Equity markets, Australia's a great place from a global perspective in terms of equity markets, but it's still struggling. What's the government's position in this?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much every project that we're looking at have seen significant cost inflation, probably 40 to 60% over the last 18 months. So we're essentially a cash flow lender. So provided that the cash flow of the project supports it, we would look to increase the level of debt of a project. And an example of that was Hastings. Initially, we committed 140 million. After cost increases, we ended up committing 220 million. As to whether it's enough, that remains to be seen. So, if the project can support more debt, we are prepared to basically step up. The other thing that we look at is essentially cost overrun facilities. To attract other lenders into a deal and to attract equity into a deal, there needs to be some degree of certainty that ultimately the project can be built. And if there is a risk that they're going to run out of money partway through, the government is prepared to look at, the NAIF and the other government lenders are prepared to look at providing cost overrun facilities to fund that potential increase.
Okay. Michael, from an equity markets perspective, how do investors at the moment, do they view that support? Obviously, Frank's saying government gets involved, it provides almost an underwriting element to a project, provides confidence. Two parts to it. One, is there capacity, or what kind of capacity is there in equity markets for some of these bigger projects? And two, what are the attitudes when they see this government support or policy support? Is that a factor that weighs heavily, or is it discounted?
I think the equity markets are now, pretty well, used to the inflation of these projects. You've seen plenty of feasibility studies come out recently, so they're expecting these cost increases, and we've seen it blow out in real time, and projects on the ground getting built, and talking to the 40 to 50% cost increases on capital of projects. It's well entrenched and priced in, I'd say, in the equity markets. Happens quite efficiently, as you'd expect. And then in terms of government funding for cost overrun of projects, it's going to be well received. Obviously, private equity is going to warmly receive any kind of government handout for these projects. And we've seen numerous ones. There's probably a few more to play out in terms of cost overruns. But it seems to be easing in probably in the last six months. But it's still those pressures are still there. Probably the shorter term thing is probably just around the skilled labour shortages in Western Australia, or Australia more broadly, is still definitely prevalent, and it doesn't seem to be abating anytime soon. So that'll probably just add to, especially the amount of projects that need to come online. That's probably an ongoing concern for many of these projects, all trying to get up at the same time that essentially need to happen.
In terms of overall financing structures, if you kind of think back, 15, 20 years, you wanted to build a project, you put your feasibility study out there, you kind of went 60% debt and then 40% equity, and it was a pretty vanilla model. These days, obviously, there's streaming involved, there's private equity involved. Do you see government essentially, or strategic funding, being a much larger part of all critical minerals projects, which are most minerals these days going forward? Like, are we looking at a transition in the way financing operates in the mining space? Anyone?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that, because before joining NAIF, I was at ANZ for 17 years, and the reality is that the commercial banks have very limited appetite for new commodities. So they're sort of moving away. Obviously they've moved away out of the coal sector big time, but they just don't have the appetite to move into the new, like the transition metals. So therefore, that's why, like NAIF, EFA, the NRF and CFC have essentially been set up because there was a massive gap in the market, and the only way to get these projects up and running is for the government to essentially provide liquidity to get these things up and running. Yeah. Now our aim is to crowd in other investors, so we don't want to be the sole lender. So what we do is we typically provide very long dated debt, so that the commercial banks can take the lower risk, shorter dated transactions, and by providing the cost overrun support and things like that, hopefully that will provide enough support to attract other investors into these projects.
Yeah, in terms of financing, good projects still manage to get finance that are economic. It goes without saying. And then in terms of how it's kind of changing in the more recently, we've seen offtake deals. Offtake of actual raw materials is taking on value. We've seen the lithium guys trade their physical product for equity stakes in downstream projects, but also equity stakes in the projects as well. So there's a different mix coming in, but as the downstream users or OEMs kind of realise that they're short this material or want a diversification of their supply chains, they're starting to wake up to that. It's only taken them 10 years, and they're starting to put a value on it and actually pay up to the guys that hold the resource in the ground. So we're seeing some financing come from alternative measures such as that.
Namali, you're nodding along there. This all resonates for you guys?
Yeah, absolutely. I would absolutely agree. And I guess the challenge for a lot of the juniors is exactly what Frank was saying about trying to encourage commercial financial markets to either have a greater risk appetite or to have the government reduce that risk burden so that they will step in and support some of these projects, basically. When we talk to industry, it's probably the number one issue is just, project financing, the equity aspect of it, yeah.
How much collaboration between the different sources of funding are you seeing in the market? When you're talking to the corporates and they're looking for this project finance, is there a general understanding between the different sources of working together and providing a structure that works, or is there competition for different parts of the financing structure?
In my view, we work very closely. With other sources of liquidity. Like I said, there are 4 investment vehicles, government-owned investment vehicles in Australia. We also work very closely with the foreign export credit agencies. So, like the larger deals may have, say, Korean offtake. So we'd be working with K-Shore, and if they say have a Canadian component on the construction site, we could be working with them, or with a German equipment provider. So ultimately, the aim is to tap all sources of liquidity, at least on the debt side, and then on the equity side, it's on the offtake. So if the offtake is going into Europe or Korea, try to get those offtakers to invest into the project as well, and make it pretty clear that if all of the parties don't come together, these projects won't happen.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, from an equity point of view, I think investors don't want to see a project reliant on government funding to actually get up, but would almost, we wouldn't mind co-investing or just coming on alongside on the debt facility, as Frank kind of touched on. If it is, completely reliant on government funding, you'd probably question the economic viability of the project, but we yet to kind of see that kind of fully play out at the moment.
I've got a few more questions about downstream, but I just wanted to stop there because we are getting short on time. Were there any questions around just the commodities or specific aspects of anything that's been mentioned so far that anyone wanted to throw at the panellists?
Hi, good morning. My name is Kumar. Just a private investor. Question on financing. When you look at certain projects, how do you decide who to finance and who not to finance? And do you consider commodity cycles into that as well? Like, say, for example, Hastings rare earth project was there from last almost a decade now. They knew they have this project, and they were looking for financing for a long time as well. But this financing from the government only came last year, I think. So how do you decide those things?
Yeah.
And which ones you choose, because there are a lot of them.
Yeah. So we carry out extensive due diligence on every project that we do. So we appoint independent engineers. Well, actually, we have engineers within NAIF, and then we have independent engineers who will review these projects. So firstly, we take a view on does the project stack up, technically? Where does it sit on the cost curve? Does the company have sufficient, technical skills to actually develop the project? How much test work have they done? What's the quality of the reserve? All of that goes into the mix. So that's sort of step one. Then we also look at where is the product going? Have they locked in offtake? How firm is that offtake? Where does it go to? Like, as in, is the, does it go to a like aligned country? So therefore, is the project aligned with government policy from that point of view? And then we look at what other sources of liquidity the company may have access to. So it's no good saying well, we're going to pick that one, and we're the only supplier of liquidity. So then we look at who else they could potentially tap, and this is where it's important to work out if the offtake, say, is going to Korea. Are the is the Korean Export Credit Agency was it interested in the deal? And if it's got German equipment, is the German Export Credit Agency potentially interested in it? So it's essentially building a syndicate before we make an investment decision. Once we do all of that, then we sort of pick the one that we will invest. Now, in some commodities where the market is strong enough, we're going to pick more than one. Like in the case of rare earths, we're actually working on 3 different rare earths projects at the moment.
Just one more last question. How do you decide on the risk and the opportunity side of the project? Let's just say, US came with IRA. The underlying thought process of IRA is to benefit US primarily. So what they're doing, they're funding these critical projects all around the world. And they have some partners like Australia and some of the countries. But eventually is to benefit to the US. That's what they want to do, because they know this is the upcoming fuel energy of the world, the new energy. So this is one side of it. And then the second side of it is like, it's pretty much like the second side of the coin. So if there is a risk, there is opportunity as well. So in terms of opportunity, how does the government thinks about this? What will, say for example, you're putting all this money into these projects, and eventually, let's just say if they're not benefiting Australia as a country, because eventually it's funded by government, so government's main job is to eventually think of their own people and the projects later on. Like, say for example, one of the lithium company went into administration, like Bald Hill. It was not funded by the government, but now the Chinese were thinking to take that over, but that was blocked. So, but because now the direct funding is also coming from the government, before they used to be private, how do you think in those terms?
Well, the first thing that we always look at is, is the company able to repay the loan? That's sort of the first thing. Like, we're not going to finance a project if we don't think that they can repay, the debt, because we do want the money back at the end of the day. In terms of benefits, we don't just look at, sort of security of supply, but we also look at what public benefit does a project create, and we actually measure that. And that's how many jobs does it create locally? What is the flow-on effect of all of that? How much tax does it pay in Australia? So it's not just a case of, okay, like this particular project, like it's okay, we're going to dig and ship it, and therefore all of the benefit flows to the US. That's not really true, because it will still generate significant public benefit in Australia, because of local jobs and the flow-on effect of that. So all of that comes into the mix, and I think the IRA and the the Australian government's critical minerals policy are quite well aligned on that.
Any other questions?
Thanks a lot.
Got a couple of minutes left. I think on Kumar's point there, a lot of it's about the downstream and the benefit to Australia and securing supply chains, etc. Australia hasn't had a great track record in trying to develop downstream industry. is there an opportunity there to build that industry, and what would you like to see happen? happen to make that a reality? Namali, maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, I think I'm going to be repetitive here in terms of, I think essentially there just needs to be that enabling environment to support that midstream, and it is a combination of incentives, some kind of, whether it's tax incentives or other incentives, as well as infrastructure support, I'd say, are the two big things that need to happen to create that midstream. And then obviously there's diversifying with partners at the downstream end as well.
Yeah. I mean, as an investor, when we look at downstream processing, is that downstream processing potentially increases the returns, but it also often increases the risks. So what we would like to see is more demonstration plants, so that large-scale demonstration plants, move away from the the bench-scale test work and show us that it actually works at a reasonable scale, before we finance it. And a really good example of that is Alpha HPA. They've built a significant size, like a demonstration plant, roughly the size of a football field, as opposed to like a commercial plant, which would be 10 times the size of that. But that plant was partially funded through government grants, so a combination of equity and government grants. So both parties have skin in the game, and now they're at a stage where they're actually talking to investors or basically debt funders such as NAIF to move to the next stage.
Okay.
Could I just add to that, in developing the midstream and with some of that technology and capacity that comes along, Australia's really lacking in I guess, a pipeline of technological experts to support the midstream. So that's another area that's a massive red flag, that in order to even just at the demonstration scale to have that, we need the technological expertise, which there's not enough of, basically. But sorry, Michael.
Yeah, that's right. No, I was going to touch on similar points that we touched on earlier, is around just energy policy. Having a long-term supply of low-cost baseload power to actually build out these downstream plants is absolutely critical. And then touching on Namali's point around skilled labour, to actually it's not even just the mining industry that is struggling with underground mining engineers and metallurgists and etc. It's also the midstream chemical engineers required for these projects. You don't see or Australian universities putting out the number of graduates that are going to be required in this area to actually build out a mid to downstream side of things. And then we talk about the disasters that has basically been in Australian projects going downstream. You just have to look at if you go back to HPAL or even the ramp up of Linus's rare earth project. Everyone's got nightmares of those things ramping up, and I'm sure we'll probably have plenty more in the future, because these new critical minerals are not easy. They're basically just complex chemistry sets at the back end, but there's only one way to tried and tested of going through and testing out these plants on larger scale. Demonstration plants is one way to de-risk that going forward.
Okay. We are out of time. Any final questions for the panel? If not, Namali, Frank, Michael, thanks very much.